Hey everyone, I am Morgan Dunbar from TNO, the Neighborhood Organization, and Flemo Media, and today we are switching up gears a little bit to deliver to you a 30-minute tutorial in Pro Tools. So stick around in there, and we will be keeping up with the videos every Friday for you. Okay guys, so here we are in Pro Tools. We have a session here. This is a recent Wrong Brothers demo. So I'm going to switch all the outputs here correctly. So we're just setting it to the outputs of the interface I'm using. So this middle take here is the take we're going to be using. So I'm going to have to splice around the first and second takes. So as you can see, we have 8 channels here. A classic kind of demo amount of tracks. And the only plugin so far is one trim plugin on the guitar, just flopping the face. So I've selected that middle take and made an edit with Command E to separate it from the previous 2 takes, from the previous take and the later take. So as you can see here, you can select any of the separate takes now. So I'm going to grab from the beginning of the intro here on the second take all this and delete it. And I'm going to do the same thing for the last take. So I'm going to take all this. We're going to take it, chop it, and that's just hitting the delete key. So now the very ending here, we have a little segment we want to add on to the end. I'm just going to clean up these fades a little bit. So I'm chopping out the last section and lining up where this final hit comes in. Those are some noises at the end here. So when you select a track, you can either hold and drag, and you'll select all the other regions. Or if you hit Shift, you'll select multiple. Or if you hit Command, you'll be able to select the individual ones that you want. So those are really important for those beginning key commands. There's going to be a lot of Shift, Option, and Command in Pro Tools. So I've got this somewhat lined up now. So as you can see, the layout is similar to Logic. It does have a few differences, as you can see. I find the grid a little bit cleaner in Pro Tools. So now what I'm doing here is hitting Command F to create that fade marker, right? Now if I select the inside portions here, it's going to create a crossfade when I do the same Command F. Grab those little segments there. So the guitar I want to continue out where it is, and the drums I just want to add that additional ending piece. Perfect. Now we can take these last fades. Now what I'm going to do here is create groups. So I've kind of got my basic edit, and then everything I do now is going to be either drums or guitar, essentially. So I'm creating a group with Command G, opening up the dialog box, and selecting D for drums, selecting both guitars, Command G again, labeling it guitar. There's going to be multiple guitars, so this is only guitar 1. And we've created another group there. So now when I press either of the sections, guitar or drums, it's going to move all the tracks in that group. And there we go. So I'm fading to the very beginning of the drum part, and I'm leaving some feedback on the guitar in the intro. It's just so it blends fairly nicely. And this is all considered editing still. We haven't really gotten to any mix stage yet. But this is all very important for keeping your track clean. So our track listing here, I'll go through it, is kick, snare, overhead right, overhead left. We have 2 rooms, and then our 2 guitar tracks. So the drum set takes up 6 mics, and the guitar is taking up 2. Although this is live recorded together in the same room, so the room is adding a lot of tone to our guitars as well. So I'm doing a quick volume check here. I'm just going through every single level, and just matching them to where it needs to be. So I'm pushing up a single channel, sometimes soloing it to really hear what's going on specifically, but I'm keeping all the channels on all the time and listening to how they relate to each other. It'd be pretty useless if I set a volume and solo, went on to the next track, set a volume and solo, because then when you unsolo them all, who knows what it's going to sound like together. So I'm going through my guitar tracks. As I said earlier, we did flip the phase on one of them. So I'm just checking how the phase plays out as I level up these 2 mics. Okay. So I'm going to start adding some plugins here. And we're going to do the bare minimum for this mix. And I usually like to start with the drums, because there's some cleaning elements that are gonna happen typically every mix for me. A lot of like reducing low end, there's slight compression moves that I'm gonna do. So here we are in the snare, and I'm just removing some low end here. Just the instruments that aren't gonna require. Now I made a mistake here because I selected all the drums while I had them both grouped and pulled it to the beginning. But I forgot to remember to keep the guitars lined up with that. So now we're pulled back to the beginning here. And that seems pretty good. I'm gonna make a little chop in the guitar here and fade it up to that point, just for a little more dynamics in the track itself. So the mapping out of the session is pretty similar to Logic. You can see the transport window on the top moving through there, the grid in a similar area, and your functions and your toolbar at pretty much the same place. Now the key commands are going to be completely different, but you can select Pro Tools key command preferences in Logic, and they'll be more lined up, so you're going to have to do less swapping around, thinking between Pro Tools or Logic. And this is what I do very regularly. I typically use both these softwares consistently. So now I'm creating buses for certain tracks here. Because I have matching overhead pair, and because I have 2 guitar tracks for the same single tone for guitar, I'm going to reduce these into single buses. So I have an overhead bus, because if I add an equalizer to one of the channels, and it's slightly different from the other one, it's going to negatively affect the final mix. Versus if I process them both with the exact same equalizer, there's not going to be any phase issues. We're not going to have to worry about anything. It's going to sound fine. And that way I only have to manipulate the overhead bus. This is really helpful too for automation and later stages in mixing, because instead of automating several like random tracks, you can just find your buses, even maybe select your 5 main important buses and then ride those. So you can see the level on the second room there is very low. That mic happened to be in the floor of a bathroom near the studios we were recording. It's got a very strange sound, but useful for this kind of punk track. So same thing on the guitars here. I'm setting up the equalizer to just remove some low end, finding that perfect point where we're not cutting out any important meat of the guitars, but we're cleaning out all of that kind of emptiness in the bass that we aren't going to need. That bass will be filling up later. Another simple fade with Command F. Now it's important to go back and reference every time you do any kind of processing. So if you add an equalizer, go back, listen to it on, off, see what you're really doing and if it's really important. unless there's always going to be more in a lot of ways for mixing. So now I'm bussing these the same way as the overheads. I'm selecting both tracks, holding Option Shift, selecting that output, and taking it to a new track. Making sure it's an aux input, not an audio track. So we create our bus, and I'm gonna see here with on our first guitar still, pulling up a little bit of low end or mid low end, because this guitar is a little thin for my ears. Now it's important to remember the difference between additive EQ and subtractive EQ, because so here I'm adding lots in the low mids, right? But I could also just remove some of this top end here. So if I pull this down, it kind of evens out best of both worlds. Just important if you're adding too much, you may notice that it'll be negative, and if you're taking away, it's usually a little bit less apparent and a little more positive for your track. Okay, so we're going to dive into some compressors here. We're going to start on the kick. I'm going to grab a 76. So most of the plugins here are going to be standalone Pro Tools plugins, the EQ7, but this here is a Waves plugin, the CLA Classic Compressor 1176. But not to worry, these same principles can be used in there's the stock 76. There is several stock compressors that are very easy to use, just like this. So what I'm doing here is I checked how much input we were getting. I only want a couple decibels of gain reduction here. If you can see in the VU meter, we're just getting a couple dB, and then I'm leveling it back up to where it sounds good to me. I'm doing the same equalizer moves. This kick is missing a little bit of top end, so I'm gonna find where that click is in the kick and just add a little bit. And that seems to be it. Pulled it down. So as you can see, I do pretty drastic listening moves to find the frequencies I'm looking for, but then the actual cuts or hills are pretty shallow. I don't like to do too much ever. I'm just playing around with this low end to see if there's any sweet spots in the kick I'd like to boost up. That seems okay there. So now, because we've lowered some of this low end and rolled off the very lowest frequencies on our snare, I'm going to kind of make up for that by finding our kind of fundamental frequency, or a really big impact point for the snare, and boost that up a tiny bit, as you can see. We'll keep playing around here. Maybe we can find it a little more dead on. And then just referencing the level. So I'm going to grab another compressor here. This is another Waves compressor, but again, the same principles apply to any compressor. I'm going to remove the threshold a little, or remove the compression level, the ratio down a little bit. We're going to turn the threshold just until, again, we get a couple dB of gain reduction. I find the DBX 160 here does a really cool job of just keeping that kind of constant smack on the snare very nicely. Okay, so we've got our minimal snare compression there. What I'm going to do here is create another bus, but instead of bussing anything through it this time, we're just going to create it for a reverb. So I'm going to call it snare reverb. I'm going to add a stock Pro Tools plugin called Air Spring Reverb. It's a really nice free spring that comes with Pro Tools. So as you can see, it's got a pretty high reverb time unless you adjust it. I'm going to turn that down because we don't want too much reverberation coming off our snare. We just want a nice slight spring sound every time that's smacking away. So I'm checking my my send to it, just finding that perfect level. pulling up the low cut a little bit because I don't want any of the low end of the snare to pull through. I just want that kind of high end smack to be pulled through and resembled through the reverb. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Go to my guitar track here. So the track that I didn't add the low end to and take out some of the high end, that's going to be our more kind of piercing guitar track, and I'm going to send that specifically to a reverb just because it's not going to get muddied with our other guitar's low end. Now for this kind of more melodic but still very rhythmic element, I'm going to turn the reverb up, the length quite a bit. And I'm strictly doing this just for the kind of tone of the spring on the song. This is kind of an emulation of a very old school kind of punk track. So having a really nice digital reverb isn't going to help. A really solid tape reverb won't even sound quite right. I find the spring really gives a kind of an old school live feel with old spring reverbs and amps blowing out. That's the sound I get. So now what I've done here is selected the drum tracks, routed it through a drum bus. So in the same way that I have both the overheads going into a bus, and I'm doing certain processing on that instead of just on the individual overheads, I'm going to do the same thing for the drum bus. So everything gets sent to the drum bus, even our snare reverb. Now it's important to make sure that all the outputs are sent to the right place, because it's all too common to forget to send that overhead bus or miss your reverb, and then your mix is totally out of whack. So make sure you have the right tracks sending to your buses. And then what I'm going to do here is send both my final mix, like my processing buses for the drum bus and the guitar bus, send both of those into a master. Now we're not going to get into mastering today or even any real mix bus processing, but this is kind of the first stage of a mix. So now that all this is kind of set up, I'll be able to dive in deeper and deeper over time, and kind of add and take away until it's the perfect mix. At least for me, at least for my ears. There's no such thing as a perfect mix, I suppose. Only finished. So now on the drum bus here, I'm doing a little bit of compression. Very light again. Nothing I've done is above 2 decibels of gain reduction likely. It's a pretty raw punk track, so too much compression is really just going to kill the dynamic of this. It doesn't have a huge range anyways. It's pretty driving forward the whole time. So just a little bit of compression to keep everything even, but not to squash it. Now on one of the rooms here, I'm cranking up a tape emulator here. Now there's a couple free good tape emulators out there. Maybe I'll do another video specifically on saturation and tape emulation plugins. Let me know if you'd be interested in that in the comments below. But otherwise, we're using the Waves Kramer tape here. On the room, I find adding a huge amount of saturation or distortion to if you have multiple rooms to work with, just to one of the rooms, almost gives a parallel compression vibe for the drums without setting up a parallel compressor. And especially when you do things like add extra shower, bathroom, hallway room mics, things that are going to be a little more abstract in their tone. It's really fun to explore and experiment with effects and saturation on those things. So now that's bumping a little bit more. There's a huge level of energy that's been kind of added back into the mix after adding these compressors. I'm just tweaking some final levels now. It seems most things need a retweak once you do any kind of level of processing. But make sure to keep that original vision of the mix in your mind. It should never stray too far from that first solid kind of half an hour session you put together. You don't want to lose that energy you had. So now, similar to our drum bus, I'm going to toss another API 2500. It's another Waves plugin on our master or mix bus here. Go for very light compression, less than even a decibel. Okay. So now, because the mix bus is hitting a little hard here, I'm going between both the drums and guitar. I'm just turning them down the slightest bit. That's the best thing about doing groups early, is that everything after the fact, you can just level out so gently between the two. And then once your mix is a little more finessed and you have plugins helping you out where they need to, it's a little easier to reset volumes and feel really comfortable about where they're headed. So I'm just experimenting with blowing out some low end on this guitar and seeing how much we can add and take away there. We have a little bit of extra time here at the very end. We're going to clean that up a tiny bit. We don't need quite that long of a fade out. And we're going to stretch out the guitar a tiny bit. So I know a lot of this isn't flashy or, super exciting tips, but this is the real honest bare bones of the first half an hour after we've tracked something, we have a demo. This is what I'm going to do right away. And just clean it up, make it sound decent right off the bat, and then it'll expose to me where it needs to be worked on really heavily. So this is a fun tip. I find guitars typically recording amps with dynamic microphones. It usually doesn't quite have that huge, crispy condenser top end. So what I'm doing here is I'm on the bus. I'm adding just a tiny bit of a vintage exciter, and all this is doing is adding some interesting harmonics. And I'm playing between the different settings here. And there's just a slight level of grit that becomes more apparent. With our drums, when we add a bunch of saturation on the rooms, and it becomes this big boomy kind of garage kit, our guitars, we can really easily kind of emulate that as well with just a simple exciter. But it's important not to do it It's important not to overdo it with saturation. So what I'm going to do here is select the entire sequence. I'm going to take the output of our mix bus here, which is titled master, and send it into an audio track here. We're going to label it today's date and mix one. Now, I actually made a small error here because I do this every time. I made it an aux input. I need to make it an audio track. We're going to be recording our mix here. So new track, instead of aux, it goes to audio track. Once again, we do the mix one, today's date. Okay. Now, if I didn't change this output from our main compressor here, there's nothing limiting, there's nothing squashing our mix bus. So it's going to be very raw, and it could peak at any moment, it could clip, it could be way too loud. So I'm going to turn the whole thing down slightly. You can see it's peaking there already. Yep. So I'm going to pull that down until we get nothing. There you go. And just raise it back up until it's about as far as we can go without worrying about clipping at this point. Eventually, we'll get a full, mix on this. We will get a full master on this, and it should be radio play ready. But for now, we're getting our first impression, what the song sounds like, and where we want it to go. So all I'm doing here is the same as recording any other track or even in Logic. We're record enabling the channel. We're hitting space to record. And in this case, we're just listening to our mixes that we record. So you can see it printing here. We have our drum intro. The full mixes come in. So this is a great thing to do instead of bouncing your track, because you get to listen to the entire thing. You get to see anything that could be happening, any minor inconsistencies. And of course, there's no way to send over files that are corrupt or that have missing segments or cut off files if you're listening to it before you send it. So please do that. Please always reference your tracks before you send anything out, especially before you upload anything. So you can see there the dynamic range is not very deep for this track. We have that little intro where it's all rooms, and then it comes down to the close-up mics there. And you can see it's pretty much the dynamic level that the guitar tracks or the overheads are. The whole track. So in a different situation, if this is more of a singer-songwriter tune with a lot of acoustic elements, this would be a completely different sounding and looking mix. But for us today, we got what we need. Take this, disable the record, solo that so it's all we can listen to, and we're going to save it. And we are free to send this off wherever we need to. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been a 30-minute tutorial in Pro Tools. We did a quick mix, the starting point for the rest of the track here. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I see you next week for our next Friday tutorial. We're going to be keeping up with Pro Tools now. All right, thanks for watching.